July 19, 1864, Nanjing falls. Qing dynasty forces breach the walls after a siege that has lasted years. Inside the city, the remnants of a state that had called itself the Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace, Taiping Tianguo, governed by a man who believed, with what every account describes as absolute sincerity, that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. The fighting in the final days is catastrophic. Contemporary accounts describe fires burning for weeks. The Qing commander Xiuquan writes in his report to the emperor that when his troops entered the city, they found very few survivors. The larger conflict that Nanjing's fall concludes had, over 14 years, produced a death toll that most historians estimate at somewhere between 20 and 30 million people. Some estimates go higher. The range itself tells you something about the scale of the accounting problem. It is, by most measures, one of the deadliest civil conflicts in recorded history, and it began with a man who failed an examination. Not once, 4 times. The same examination, the same journey to Guangzhou, the same cells, the same days of writing, composing, demonstrating everything he had been trained since childhood to demonstrate, and then the same walk home. There is a version of this story that begins with theology, with politics, with the structural weaknesses of the Qing dynasty and the grievances of rural China. All of that is real, and we will get to it. But the story begins, more precisely, with a man who was told 4 times, by the most authoritative institution his civilization had, that he was not what he believed he was. What he did with that is what this episode is about. Before going further, the same thing needs to be said here that has been said in every episode this season. These cases manifest destiny. The 1,000-year Reich, the Mahdi of Sudan, and now they share a structural pattern, a gap, a claim, a framework that transforms failure into preparation and setback into confirmation. That structural pattern is analytically useful, but the moral weight of each case is not the same. The Taiping movement was a peasant uprising against a dynasty that was itself partially a vehicle for Western imperial interests in China. The people who joined it had real grievances. The program it proposed was, in some respects, more ambitious than anything the Qing had attempted. The structural similarity to other prophetic movements does not make it morally equivalent to ideologies of conquest or genocide. What makes the Taiping case essential to this season is something different. It is a case where we can see most clearly what happens when the internal logic of a prophetic framework, the specific way it handles failure, manages authority, and distributes the costs of being wrong, becomes the mechanism of the movement's own destruction. The Mahdi's state was entered from outside. By the Maxim gun, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom was hollowed out from inside. By the prophecy, Xiuquan was born in 1814 in Fuyuan Shui village, Guangdong province. His family was Hakka, a Han Chinese subgroup whose name means, roughly, guest families. The Hakka had migrated south over centuries, settling in regions already occupied by other communities, arriving late enough that the land and local power were already distributed. In Guangdong, they competed with the Cantonese-speaking Punti population for land and standing. They were Han Chinese by ancestry, but outsiders by history. This is not a minor biographical detail. It is the ground Xiuquan grew up on, a community that belonged to the civilization, was recognized as part of it, and was nonetheless treated as second rank within it. The tension between Hakka and Punti communities would eventually produce localized violence of serious scale. In the 1850s, tens of thousands dead in clan wars. The world Hong grew up in was already organized around the kind of grievance that, under certain conditions, a prophetic framework in enter and fill. He was, by all accounts, exceptionally intelligent as a child. The village invested in his education. The imperial examination system was, in its conception, a meritocracy. Any male subject of the emperor could sit for the exams. Regardless of birth or wealth, a man who passed could enter government service, rise through the bureaucracy, earn the recognition that the civilization reserved for its most capable. The examinations tested knowledge of the Confucian classics, literary composition, the ability to reason within an established framework. For a Hakka family in Guangdong, for a community that was Han but not fully recognized, educated but not yet arrived, the examination system was a promise. It said, the category you were born into is not permanent. Demonstrate what you are. We will see it. Hong Xiuquan believed the promise. He passed the preliminary county-level exams on his first attempt, which was genuinely difficult. He was good enough. He had always been good enough. The village had always known he was good enough. He traveled to Guangzhou to sit for the provincial examinations. He failed. He came back. He studied. He traveled again. He failed again. He came back. He studied. He traveled again. He failed again. 15 years. 4 attempts. The same journey. The same cells. The same days of writing. The same walk home. It is worth sitting with what this actually means before moving to what happened next. The examination system in Qing China was not selecting from a small pool. It was selecting from a population of hundreds of millions, with a pass rate at the provincial level that typically ran below 1%. The men who failed were not, for the most part, men who had misunderstood the material. They were men who had mastered the material and been told, nonetheless, that there were others who had mastered it more completely, or more elegantly. And this was something everyone who sat for the exams understood without saying more luckily. Hong was brilliant. Everyone who knew him said so. The village had bet on him. His family had organized their resources around his education. He had spent his adult life in preparation for a system that was supposed to see him. The system had looked at him, 4 times, and said, "Not you." There is a question that the historical sources cannot fully answer. Because Hong himself was not the kind of man who would have written it down directly. What does that do to a person? What does it cost? Internally, to be that certain of your own exceptional ability, to have the people closest to you share that certainty, and then to be declined 4 times by the institution that was supposed to recognize it. The third failure, in 1837, appears to have broken something. After the 1837 failure, Hong was carried home to his village. What happened to him is documented through his own later accounts and through the accounts of people who knew him, sources that require care. Since they were produced after Hong had become the founder of a prophetic state and had every reason to frame earlier experiences as preparation. Keeping that in mind, the accounts agree that after the 1837 failure, Hong became severely ill. Weeks of fever, delirium, something that the people around him experienced as a mental collapse, and that Hong himself, later, would describe as a journey. In his visions, he was taken to heaven. He met an old man with a golden beard who gave him a sword and told him to slay demons. He met an elder brother who taught him how to use it. He was shown things he did not yet have words for. Then he came back. He recovered. He went back to teaching in a village school. He applied for the examinations again. In 1843, he failed for the 4th time, came home, and sat in his family's house with the weight of 15 years behind him. And then he picked up a pamphlet. The pamphlet was called Good Words to Admonish the Age. It had been written by Liang Afa, a Chinese Christian convert working with Protestant missionaries in Guangzhou, and distributed near the examination halls where thousands of educated, frustrated young men gathered every few years. Many of them primed for a framework that might explain why the world was not delivering what it had promised. Hong had actually received the pamphlet years earlier, probably in 1836. At the examination halls in Guangzhou, he had glanced at it and set it aside. After his fourth failure, he read it, and the visions from 1837, the old man with the golden beard, the elder brother, the sword. The demon suddenly had an explanation. The old man was God the Father. The elder brother was Jesus Christ. The demons he had been commanded to slay were the evil spirits corrupting China, the Manchu rulers of the Qing dynasty, who had conquered China 2 centuries earlier and governed it still, and the false religious practices that Hong now read through the lens of Liang Afa's text. As demonic, Hong Xiuquan was, he concluded, the younger son of God, the brother of Jesus Christ, sent to China to complete the redemption of the world. The examination system had not failed to recognize him. The examination system was one of the things he had been sent to overthrow. 2 things about this sequence deserve attention, because the dramatic shape of the story can obscure both of them. The first is the timeline. The vision preceded the explanation by 6 years. Hong did not receive a divine calling and then construct a theology around it. He had a severe psychological crisis, recovered, returned to ordinary life, failed again, and only then, reading a pamphlet in the aftermath of his 4th rejection, found a framework that made the earlier experience legible as something other than illness. 6 years. The vision sat in him, unexplained, for 6 years. Whether that makes what followed more credible or less is a question each person will answer according to their own lights. But the chronology matters because it pushes back against the simple narrative of a man who decided to claim divine status and then invented a supporting story. The supporting story was already there. The framework arrived later, from outside, from a pamphlet written by a Chinese Christian convert that Hong had been handed at an examination hall and had set aside. The second thing is what the pamphlet actually was. Liang Afa's text was not Protestant Christianity. It was a Chinese translation and adaptation of Protestant missionary materials, a document that filtered Western theology through the vocabulary and concerns of an educated Chinese reader in the 1830s. When Hong Xiuquan read it and then built his own theology from it, he was not receiving Christianity as the missionaries who had inspired Liang Afa understood it. When Protestant missionaries later visited Nanjing and examined Hong's theology, they were troubled. The Taiping concept of God, of Christ, of salvation and heaven differed from Protestant orthodoxy in ways that missionaries documented carefully. Some found the differences minor. Others found them fundamental. This matters not to adjudicate the theological question. It matters because the sentence Hong Xiuquan believed he was the brother of Jesus Christ requires unpacking, because the Jesus of Taiping theology was not the Jesus of the pamphlet that had given Hong his framework. And the heaven Hong described was something new, built from available materials, in a specific place and time, by a man who was doing something more than misreading a text. What he built was a synthesis. It was his. Hong spent the next several years working through what he now believed. He baptized himself in a ritual he devised, and baptized his closest friend and early collaborator, Feng Yunshan. He began preaching. He destroyed the Confucian tablets in the school where he taught, an act that ended his employment immediately, and announced to anyone paying attention that this was not a man interested in accommodation with the existing order. In 1844 and 1845, he and Feng traveled through Guangdong and into neighboring Guangxi province, preaching. Hong was, by the accounts of those who heard him, a compelling presence. Years of examination training had produced something that the examiners had declined to recognize, but that crowds could feel. A man who had organized his entire adult life around the capacity to make an argument, to hold a room, to demonstrate that an idea was true by the force with which he inhabited it. The message was both theological and political. God the Father was the ruler of heaven and earth. The Manchu Qing dynasty had conquered China in the 17th century and ruled it under false pretenses, not as sons of heaven but as usurpers who had brought corruption and suffering. The demons Hong had been sent to slay were real and could be identified. This was not an abstract proposition for communities in rural Guangxi in the 1840s. The First Opium War, concluded in 1842, had forced China to cede Hong Kong to Britain and open treaty ports to foreign trade on terms that humiliated the dynasty visibly. Tax burdens were heavy. Local officials were corrupt. The gap between what the Confucian order promised to Cosmos, in which proper governance produced proper lives, and what daily life actually delivered was wide and getting wider. The Hakka communities in Guangxi, where Feng had been building connections, had the additional grievance of outsider status, recognized as Han Chinese, treated as subordinate by established communities, competing for land, excluded from local power. Into this world, Hong's message arrived. By Tishon's Oshemset Pinjishont, the organization that Feng had built around Hong's theology, the God Worshippers Society. Bai Shangdi Hui had tens of thousands of members in Guangxi. They were armed. They were organized around a discipline that Hong's religious code enforced seriously. No opium. No alcohol. No unauthorized relations between men and women. Punishments consistently applied. They were also, many of them, people who had lost things land, livelihoods, family members to the clan wars between Hakka and Punti communities that had been intensifying through the decade. People who had genuine reasons to want the world to be different, and who had found in the Heavenly Kingdom a framework that named who was responsible for their suffering, identified the enemy precisely, and promised that the enemy was going to lose. The Qing dynasty sent forces to suppress them. The forces were defeated. To the God worshippers, this was not a military surprise. It was the prophecy confirming itself. The Mahdi was supposed to prevail. The Heavenly Kingdom was supposed to prevail. The pattern is the same. Early victory as divine evidence. Belief deepened by confirmation. A movement made harder to stop by the very fact that it was succeeding. A man who had been told 4 times that he was not what he believed he was, had found, finally, a framework that told him the examination results were wrong and always had been. Now he had an army. In January 1851, Hong Xiuquan declared the founding of the Taiping Tianguo, the Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace, in the village of Jintian in Guangxi province. He was 37 years old. His movement had perhaps 20,000 armed followers. The Qing dynasty had been trying to suppress it for months. The suppression had failed, repeatedly, in ways that the movement's members read as confirmation of exactly the thing Hong had been telling them, that God was on their side, that the Qing dynasty was a corruption that heaven itself had decided to end, and that the men fighting in the name of the Heavenly Kingdom were not merely soldiers but instruments of a divine plan that could not be stopped by any earthly army. Over the next 2.5 years, the Taiping forces moved. They fought their way out of Guangxi, which was where the Qing government expected to contain them. They pushed into Hunan province. They took the city of Yuezhou on Dongting Lake. They moved down the Yangtze River. Taking Wuchang, the major city at the confluence of the Han and Yangtze rivers, they kept moving east, gathering followers, capturing weapons, absorbing communities along the route. Some of those communities joined out of genuine conviction. Some joined because the Heavenly Kingdom was winning, and the alternative was to be on the wrong side of an army with a theology that did not treat its enemies gently. In March 1853, the Taiping forces took Nanjing, the second city of China, the old Ming Dynasty capital, a city of somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people. They renamed it Tianjin, the heavenly capital, and declared it the seat of the Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace. The speed of that march from village uprising to control of Nanjing in roughly 2 years has occupied historians ever since. How did a movement that began in the hills of Guangxi defeat Qing forces repeatedly, sustain cohesion across thousands of miles of hostile territory, and take one of the most fortified cities in China? Several things contributed, and they are worth understanding separately rather than bundled together into a single explanation. The Qing military, in the early 1850s, was significantly weaker than its institutional size suggested. The dynasty had been governing a population of 300 to 400 million people with an army and bureaucracy designed for a smaller and more stable empire. The Opium War of 1839–42 had exposed structural weaknesses that the Qing court had not yet addressed. Tax revenues were under pressure. Local officials were often corrupt or incompetent. The forces sent to suppress the god worshippers were frequently undertrained, underpaid, and poorly commanded, men fighting for a government that had not given them sufficient reason to die for it. The Taiping forces, by contrast, maintained strict internal discipline enforced by a religious code that prohibited opium, alcohol, and unauthorized contact between men and women. Punishments were serious and consistently applied. The movement moved fast, lived off the land effectively, and had genuine motivation in ways that a conscript army fighting for a weakened dynasty often did not. And they were winning, which, as this season has returned to repeatedly, is not a neutral fact inside a prophetic framework. Victory is evidence. Every Qing force that retreated was the Heavenly Kingdom confirming itself. Every city that fell was the prophecy fulfilling itself in real time. The belief produced the fighting. The fighting produced the victories. The victories deepened the belief. The momentum was real, and it was self-reinforcing. But there was something else about the Taiping movement that the military explanation alone cannot account for. And it matters for understanding what this state actually was. The Taiping program, in its early years, was not only a prophetic claim. It was a political and social vision of genuine ambition in some respects, more radical than anything the Qing dynasty had considered or attempted. The Taiping land reform proposal, the Tianqian-Judu, the land system of the Heavenly Dynasty, promulgated in 1853, called for the redistribution of land on an egalitarian basis. Every family would receive land according to its size. Surplus production would go to communal storehouses. No one would go hungry because of the accident of birth into a landless family. This was, on paper, a comprehensive answer to the most urgent material grievance of the Chinese peasantry. The Taiping program also included provisions for women that had no precedent in Chinese imperial governance. Women could sit for Taiping civil service examinations. Women's units fought in the Taiping military. Foot binding, the practice of tightly wrapping young girls' feet that had been widespread in Chinese society for centuries, was prohibited. These prohibitions were enforced with varying degrees of consistency across a movement operating across enormous distances. And historians have debated how fully the ideals were realized in practice. The land reform program was particularly difficult to implement uniformly in the middle of an ongoing war, but the ideals themselves were there, written into the founding documents of the state and for the communities that joined the Heavenly Kingdom in its early years. The program was real enough to be a reason to fight. The people who marched with the Taiping were not, most of them, theological experts parsing the differences between Hong's Christianity and Protestant orthodoxy. They were people with genuine reasons to want the world to be different, who found in the Heavenly Kingdom a framework that promised a different world and had, so far, been delivering military victories. That combination, divine mandate plus a concrete social program plus a string of improbable wins, is a specific and powerful thing. It is what made the Taiping not just another failed uprising, but a movement that, for a period, genuinely threatened the existence of the Qing dynasty. Nanjing in 1853 was both the fulfillment of a prophecy and the beginning of a governing problem. Xiuquan was now the Heavenly King Tianwang, the ruler of a state controlling a large portion of southeastern China. He had 6 kings under him, each commanding military and administrative responsibilities across different regions. The heavenly capital needed to be administered. Taxes needed to be collected, even if differently from the Qing system. Food needed to be distributed. Laws needed to be enforced. Borders needed to be defended against a dynasty that was damaged but not destroyed. The land reform program, which had been the centerpiece of the social vision, was implemented unevenly. The communal system it proposed required a level of administrative coordination that the Taiping state, in the middle of an ongoing war, could not consistently provide. In practice, land distribution varied enormously by region and by commander. The storehouses that were supposed to ensure collective welfare were sometimes managed well and sometimes became instruments of local power. This is not unusual for a revolutionary movement that has seized power faster than it has built institutions. The gap between founding vision and governing reality is a feature of almost every such movement in history. What made the Taiping case distinctive was the specific mechanism by which the gap was managed, or rather, the mechanism by which it was not. Xiuquan, in Nanjing, increasingly withdrew. This is documented by multiple sources, including accounts from foreign visitors who sought audiences with the Heavenly King. He lived in a palace compound, surrounded by elaborate ritual. He issued proclamations. He composed theological texts, a volume of them, dense and internally consistent, that suggest a man genuinely inhabiting the framework rather than performing it. He adjudicated disputes through intermediaries. He did not command armies in the field. He did not personally administer the territory. The practical governance of the Heavenly Kingdom fell to the kings he had appointed, and then to conflicts between those kings, and then to the consequences of those conflicts. He had also, by this point, surrounded himself with a large number of concubines. This coexisted somewhat awkwardly with the movement's official prohibition on improper relations between men and women, and was justified by complex theological argument about the special status of the Heavenly King. Foreign visitors who documented this were not wrong to notice the tension. But the tension was absorbed, as tensions inside prophetic frameworks tend to be absorbed, through the specific claim that the rules that applied to others did not apply to the man through whom God was working. A man who had stepped into a gap in 1843, whose conviction had been contagious enough to build a movement of millions, who had walked out of his family's house with nothing but a pamphlet and a memory of a vision, had become, in Nanjing, something closer to a sacred object than a ruler, accessible only through protocol, legitimating decisions he often did not make, surrounded by a court that used his divine authority for purposes he may or may not have fully understood. This, too, is a pattern in the history of prophetic movements that successfully build states. The founder's authority rests on his claim to direct divine access. governing a state, making decisions about grain allocation, military deployment, taxation. Competing claims between powerful men is incompatible with the posture of someone who speaks only from heaven. The practical work gets done by people who use the founder's authority without being constrained by his judgment. The founder becomes the source of legitimacy rather than the source of decisions. It is, in its way, a kind of institutional success. The movement has become large enough that it no longer depends on the founder's direct involvement to function. It is also, as the next several years would demonstrate, a very specific kind of danger. The Qing dynasty, meanwhile, was not destroyed. The Taiping forces sent a northern expedition to take Beijing in 1853. It came close enough to alarm the Qing court and generate real panic in the capital, but ultimately failed. The Taiping military, stretched across an enormous front, could not sustain the campaign. A northern expedition force was eventually destroyed, far from home, cut off and starved of reinforcement. The western expedition into the Yangtze River Valley had mixed results. Territory was taken, lost, retaken. The Heavenly Kingdom controlled a significant portion of southeastern China, but its borders were contested and the defense of them was expensive in men and resources. The foreign powers, Britain and France, recently engaged in their own conflict with China, watched carefully. Some foreigners who visited Nanjing in the early 1850s were initially sympathetic. A Christian movement, however heterodox, seemed to some observers like it might be a force for modernization, even a potential partner for Western commercial interests. The missionary Griffith John visited in 1853 and found the movement impressive and theologically troubling in roughly equal measure. He was drawn to its energy and disturbed by its theology, and he said so clearly in the accounts he left. Over time, as the Taiping theology became clearer to Western observers, and as the movement's violence became more apparent, sympathy cooled. The foreign powers eventually sided with the Qing. This decision would have significant military consequences in the conflict's final years. The violence of the Taiping campaign deserves to be stated directly, because it is easy to lose in the scale of the numbers. The death toll of the Taiping conflict, the 20 to 30 million figure, was produced by several different causes operating simultaneously. Military combat was one. Famine, as agricultural production collapsed in contested regions, killed enormous numbers. Disease, in the aftermath of displacement and siege, killed more. And deliberate killing by Taiping forces of communities that resisted, by Qing forces of communities suspected of Taiping sympathy, by the logic of a 14-year war in which the distinction between combatant and civilian became increasingly difficult to maintain, killed many more. The Taiping movement was, in its founding vision, a movement for the liberation of a people from oppression. What the movement produced in practice was not simply a corruption of that vision, and not simply a betrayal of it. It was what happens when a framework that promises total transformation, divine, social, military, economic encounters, the material reality of governing a large territory in the middle of a war, with institutions that were built for a different purpose, and leaders whose authority rested on claims that could not be questioned. When the prophecy cannot be falsified, the failures cannot be acknowledged as failures. They become tests. They become the price of the vision. They become, sometimes, someone else's fault. And the someone else, inside a movement organized around absolute theological certainty, tends to get killed. The Heavenly Kingdom of great peace controlled, at its greatest extent in the mid-1850s, a territory larger than France. It governed tens of millions of people. It had a capital, a bureaucracy, a theology, a civil service examination system of its own, one that, unlike the Qing system, was open to women, and a military organized along principles derived from a mix of religious conviction and practical necessity. It also had 6 kings, each with their own armies, their own administrative domains, their own ambitions, and their own interpretations of what the Heavenly King's divine authority actually required of them in practice. This was always going to produce problems. The only question was which problem arrived first. The most powerful of the kings, in practice, was Yang Shuqing, the Eastern King, the Dongwang. Yang was not from Hong's original inner circle in the same way that some of the other kings were. He had joined the movement in Guangxi and risen through a combination of military ability and a theological innovation that, in retrospect, tells you a great deal about how prophetic authority actually functions inside a movement that has made divine access its central claim. Yang claimed that he could be possessed by God the Father, not Hong Xiuquan, the Heavenly King, the younger son of God, but God the Father himself. When Yang spoke in this state of divine possession, he was not speaking as Yang Shuqing. He was speaking as the Heavenly Father, the old man with the golden beard from Hong's original visions. This gave Yang a specific kind of authority that was within the theological framework of the Heavenly Kingdom, not just equal to Hong's own, but superior to it. Hong was the son. Yang, when possessed, was the father. The practical implications of this were significant. Yang used what some historians have called his divine ventriloquism to issue commands that Hong could not easily countermand without implying that God the Father was wrong. He used it to discipline Hong directly. There are documented instances of Yang speaking as the Heavenly Father, ordering Hong to be beaten, a humiliation that Hong endured because the theological logic, which he himself had constructed, left him no alternative. 1856. Yang Shuqing had accumulated enough practical power, military, administrative, political, that he was, in most meaningful senses, the operational ruler of the Heavenly Kingdom. Hong was the divine legitimation. Yang was the government. The framework that had given Hong his authority had produced, by its own internal logic, a man who outranked him in September 7500. Hong Xiuquan had Yang Shuqing killed. The killing was carried out by Wei Chongwei, the northern king, who arrived in Nanjing with his forces and, with Hong's authorization, massacred Yang and his household and followers. The number killed in what became known as the Tianjin incident, the incident at the heavenly capital, is disputed in the sources, as almost all numbers from this period are. Contemporary accounts range from a few thousand to 20,000. Jonathan Spence, whose reconstruction of this period is the most careful available in English, treats the figures with appropriate caution and notes the difficulty of establishing them reliably from sources produced by people with strong interests in particular versions of events. What is not disputed is the consequence. The Tianjin incident broke the internal coherence of the Heavenly Kingdom in ways that were never fully repaired. Wei Chongwei, having killed Yang at Hong's instruction, was himself killed by Hong, apparently because the scale of the massacre had gone beyond what Hong had authorized, or because Hong feared what a man capable of that kind of violence might do next, or both. Jin Rigang, another king involved in the killings, was also executed. 3 of the original 6 kings were dead within weeks of each other, killed not by the Qing dynasty but by the Heavenly Kingdom itself. Qi Dekai, who had been the most militarily capable of Hong's commanders and who had been away from Nanjing during the killings, returned, assessed what had happened, and left. He took a substantial army with him and spent the next years fighting independently in western China. never fully reconciling with the heavenly kingdom he had helped build. Eventually dying at Qing hands in 1863, Hong Xiuquan's response to the catastrophe was theological. He appointed 2 of his brothers to fill the vacuum left by the dead kings. His brothers were, by most contemporary accounts, men of limited ability who understood their elevation as a family matter rather than a revolutionary calling, men who had not built the movement, had not fought in its campaigns, had not earned the authority they were given by any of the criteria the movement itself had established for authority. He issued proclamations explaining the killings as divine judgment. The Eastern king had overreached. He had confused the vessel for the source. He had mistaken the authority of the Father that moved through him for authority of his own. The Heavenly Father had permitted the correction. The theological explanation was coherent within the framework. It was also, by any practical measure, wholly insufficient for the task of rebuilding a state that had just lost its most capable administrator and fractured its military command structure at the level of the men who actually ran things. What Hung could not do, what the prophetic framework he inhabited made structurally impossible, was acknowledge the Tianjin incident as a political failure, a structural consequence of having built a governing system around divine authority that could not survive the question of whose divine authority. To acknowledge that would have been to acknowledge that the framework itself had produced the catastrophe, and the framework could not be questioned, because the framework was God's. So the framework absorbed the catastrophe as a test, as a purification, as the removal of those whose faith had been insufficient. And the heavenly kingdom continued for 8 more years. There is a figure from the years after the Tianjin incident whose story complicates any simple reading of what the heavenly kingdom was and what ended it. His name was Hong Rengan, a cousin of Hong Xiuquan who had spent years in Hong Kong, where he had absorbed a more orthodox Protestant Christianity and, more unusually, a direct familiarity with Western institutions and technology. He arrived in Nanjing in 1859 with a reform program, the Zichao Xinshu, a new treatise on aids to administration that was genuinely remarkable for its context. Hong Rengan's program proposed modernizing the heavenly kingdom along lines that drew explicitly on Western models: newspapers, railways, a banking system, postal services, hospitals, a foreign policy based on treaties and mutual recognition rather than the assertion of divine mandate over all earthly powers. The program was sophisticated. It was written by someone who had thought seriously about the relationship between institutions, technology, and state power, someone who had observed how Western governance actually worked from proximity, rather than from the outside. It was also almost certainly too late. The heavenly kingdom in 1859 needed administrators who could govern the territory it held and generals who could defend it. What it had, increasingly, was a court organized around ritual access to a heavenly king who spent his days in theological composition, a governing structure damaged by the events of 1856, and a military command that had been rebuilt around loyalty to Hong's brothers rather than around competence. Hong Rengan was given the title of Shield King Gan Wang and real administrative authority. He was not given the time, the resources, or the institutional foundations to implement the reforms that might, in different circumstances, have meant something. He spent his years in Nanjing trying to build a modern state inside a theocracy that had already begun to hollow out, watching the territory contract and the military situation deteriorate, writing proposals that the court acknowledged and did not implement. He was captured after Nanjing fell and executed in 1864. He was 39 years old. The external pressure that ultimately destroyed the heavenly kingdom came from 2 directions simultaneously, and it is worth understanding both of them on their own terms rather than as a single force. The first was the Zhang army, the Zhangjun, built by the Qing official Zhang Guofan. Zhang was methodical, unsentimental, and interested in winning rather than heroism. But the parallel that sometimes gets drawn between him and Kitchener, who rebuilt British force against the Ma state a generation later, is imperfect. And the imperfection matters. Kitchener had the full resources of the most powerful empire in the world behind him. Xiuquan was operating within a dynasty that was simultaneously fighting the Taiping, managing intense internal Qing politics, and navigating the presence of Western powers who had their own interests in China. What he built was not a reconquest army funded by a confident empire. It was a regional militia, financed largely by local gentry, organized around personal loyalty and Confucian ideology, fighting what Zheng framed explicitly as a war to preserve Chinese civilization against a movement he considered alien in theology, in governance, and in social vision. Zheng's framing of the conflict as a civilizational defense was itself a kind of ideological claim, the idea that Confucian order was natural, legitimate, and worth killing to preserve. This framing did real political work. It mobilized gentry funding, officer commitment, and popular support in ways that appeals to Qing dynastic loyalty alone might not have managed, given how visibly damaged that loyalty was by the dynasty's evident failures over the preceding 2 decades. The Xiong army was better disciplined than the earlier Qing forces that had failed against the Taiping. It was also brutal. The reconquest of territory from the Taiping was accompanied by violence against civilian populations that Zheng documented in his private correspondence, with a combination of discomfort and acceptance, the discomfort of a man who did not enjoy what was being done, and the acceptance of a man who had decided that the outcome justified the price. The second source of external pressure was the foreign powers, and their involvement in the conflict's final years is one of the more consequential and more debated dimensions of the whole story. Britain and France had, by the early 1860s, concluded their second Opium War with China, forced additional concessions from the Qing, and arrived at a strategic calculation that would shape the conflict's end: a weakened Qing dynasty, humiliated but controllable, served Western commercial interests better than a Taiping state whose theology was heterodox, whose attitude toward foreign trade was unpredictable, and whose military trajectory was difficult to assess from Shanghai counting houses. The ever-victorious army, a force of Chinese soldiers commanded by foreign officers, was funded by Shanghai merchants and fought alongside Qing and Xiang forces in the Yangtze River Delta. The officer who commanded it, from 1862, was Charles George Gordon, the same Charles Gordon who would, 20 years later, die in Khartoum in 1862 and 1863. Gordon was not yet the figure the Victorian press would make him. He was a 30-year-old Royal Engineers officer who had come to China with the British forces during the Second Opium War and stayed. He commanded the ever-victorious army with real tactical ability. The force had been losing battles under its previous commanders, and under Gordon it began winning. He was also, even at this stage, an evangelical Christian who believed his campaigns were guided by providence, and who found the experience of fighting against a movement with its own claim to Christian divine mandate genuinely unsettling in ways he expressed in his letters home. The irony of Gordon fighting against the Taiping was one he seems to have been aware of. He noted it, in the way that a man notes something he has decided not to let change what he's doing. He kept fighting. He fought effectively, and when he returned to Britain, he brought back a reputation that the Victorian press would spend the next 2 decades building into something that would eventually lead him back to the Nile, to Khartoum, to a different siege, with a different outcome, and the same prophetic certainty. The 1862. The military situation had turned decisively against the Heavenly Kingdom. The Taiping forces still controlled Nanjing and significant surrounding territory, but the leadership vacuum created by the Tianjin incident had never been filled. The governing structure had never recovered. The territorial expansion that had made the movement seem unstoppable in the early 1850s had stalled, reversed, contracted. Into the military vacuum left by the dead and departed kings had stepped Li Xiuquan, the loyal king. The Zhongwang, a commander of genuine ability who had risen through the Taiping ranks through competence rather than proximity to Hong. He had won significant battles. He had commanded the campaigns around Shanghai that had initially pushed the ever-victorious army and Qing forces back. He was, by the accounts of foreign observers who met him, including British military officers who encountered him as an enemy and documented their encounters with something approaching respect, an impressive man. Capable, aware of the situation in ways that those around Hong apparently were not. Li Xiuquan had recommended retreat from Nanjing. The city could not be held indefinitely against the combined pressure of Zhang Guofan's Xiang army, now reinforced and resupplied, operating with the patience of a commander who had decided that time was on his side. Better to preserve the army, move to territory that could be defended, and continue the fight from a position that was not a siege. Hong Xiuquan refused. The heavenly capital was the seat of the Heavenly Kingdom. The Heavenly King could not abandon the city that God had given him. The prophecy did not permit retreat from the center of the divine plan. Li Xiuquan later wrote, in a long confession produced after his capture, a document that requires careful reading because it was produced under duress and may reflect what his captors wanted to hear as much as his actual views, that Hong had told him God would send manna from heaven to feed the starving population, that the city would be defended by divine intervention, that the prophecy guaranteed it. The manna did not come. The siege of Nanjing lasted from May 1862 to July 1864. The population inside the walls starved. Contemporary sources describe people eating grass, then bark, then leather, then things that sources of the period declined to specify. Zhang Guofan's forces maintained the encirclement with the patience of a commander who understood that time was working for him, and saw no reason to spend lives on assault when starvation would do the work. Hong Xiuquan died on June 1, 1864, inside the besieged city. The cause of his death is recorded in sources as illness, possibly disease, possibly from eating grass or roots as the food supply collapsed. He was 50 years old. He had never left Nanjing after entering it in 1853. He had lived for 11 years. Inside the walls of the city, he had declared the center of divine history, composing theology, issuing proclamations, insisting that the prophecy was still operative, that God had not abandoned the heavenly kingdom, that the manna was coming. His son, a child of 15, was proclaimed the new heavenly king by the remaining leadership. It was the kind of act that a court performs when it has run out of options but cannot acknowledge that the framework has failed. On July 19, 1864, a massive explosion breached the walls. Zhang's engineers had tunneled beneath them and detonated a large quantity of gunpowder. The Xiang army entered the city. The killing that followed lasted days. Zhang wrote to the emperor that almost no men of military age survived. Li Xiuquan was captured trying to escape, interrogated at length, and executed. The confession he produced during interrogation, which Zhang edited before sending it to Beijing, a fact that subsequent historians have spent considerable time analyzing, is one of the primary documents through which the final years of the Heavenly Kingdom are understood. The Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace was over. What the sources leave you with, in the end, is something that resists the clean framing that both contemporary observers and later historians have tried to put around it. The Qing court needed the fall of Nanjing to mean the restoration of order the Confucian civilization defended against chaos. Zheng Guofan's official reports are written in that vocabulary, and the emperor's response endorsed it. The dynasty that emerged from the conflict was not strong enough to survive another 50 years. But it could tell itself, for the moment, that the civilizational argument had won. Western observers who had eventually sided with the Qing needed the Taiping to mean something about the dangers of religious enthusiasm, the instability of heterodox Christianity, the problems that arise when non-Western societies try to absorb Western ideas without the right institutional frameworks. This reading was comfortable for reasons that had more to do with the readers than with the history. Later Chinese historians, writing under very different political conditions, found in the Taiping a proto-nationalist uprising, a peasant rebellion against feudal oppression, a precursor of the revolutionary movements of the 20th century. This reading required managing the theology carefully and the death toll even more carefully. None of these framings is simply wrong. All of them are selective. The Taiping Heavenly Kingdom was, simultaneously, a movement rooted in genuine social grievance, a state that attempted reforms more radical than anything its contemporaries had proposed, a theocracy organized around a claim that could not be questioned, and a catastrophe that killed, directly and indirectly, somewhere between 20 and 30 million people. These things are not in contradiction. They are the same movement, seen from different angles. Understanding it requires holding all of them at once, which is harder and less satisfying than any single framing and is, for that reason, the more honest approach. The Qing dynasty survived the Taiping. It survived by 48 years. It fell in 1912, when the last emperor, a 6-year-old boy named Puyi, abdicated following the Wuchang uprising, the revolution that ended 2,000 years of Chinese imperial governance and established the Republic of China. 48 years is long enough that the dynasty's survival after 1864 can look, from a distance, like recovery. It was not recovery in any complete sense. The regions devastated by 14 years of conflict, the Yangtze Valley, the provinces of Anhui, Jiangsu, Zhejiang, Hunan, Jiangxi took generations to return to their pre-war population levels. Some historians estimate that the Yangtze Valley did not fully recover demographically until the early 20th century. The infrastructure of agricultural production, market networks, and local governance that the conflict had destroyed was rebuilt slowly, unevenly, and in many places incompletely. The dynasty that emerged from the conflict was also not the dynasty that had entered it. The most consequential change was structural. The Xiong army, and the regional militias that had fought alongside it, had demonstrated something that the Qing central government could not unlearn, that Beijing could not defend itself with its own forces. Real military power had shifted to regional commanders, men like Zheng Guofan, and the men who came after him, whose loyalty to the dynasty was real but whose independence was now established by the simple fact that the dynasty had needed them to survive. The Qing court had won the war against the Taiping by conceding, in practice, the military authority it needed to fight it. The decentralization of power that resulted would shape Chinese politics for the rest of the dynasty's life, and well into the Republican period that followed. It was one of the ways the Taiping, in losing, changed the world it had tried to overthrow. The man who overthrew the Qing dynasty in 1911 was Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen was born in Guangdong province in 1866, 2 years after Nanjing fell into a Hakka family, the same ethnic community that had produced Hong Xiuquan. He grew up in a world saturated with the memory of the Taiping conflict, grandparents and parents who had lived through the war, landscapes of southern China that still bore its physical marks. The question of what had gone wrong with the Taiping, with the Qing, with China's relationship to modernity not as a historical question but as a live political one, present in the communities and conversations of his childhood. Sun later described the Taiping movement as an inspiration. He called Xiuquan a forerunner, a man who had attempted what needed to be attempted, who had seen the problem clearly even if his framework for addressing it had been inadequate to the task. The revolution's sun drew on different vocabulary: nationalism, democracy, modernization, the specific political language of the early 20th century. But its organizational roots were partly in the same Guangdong networks, the same tradition of anti-Qing resistance, the same communities that had produced the Taiping 60 years earlier. This is not a straight line. History rarely moves in straight lines, and the connection between the Taiping and the 1911 revolution is one that requires care. The movements were different in almost every specific, and drawing the line too directly flattens the real differences between them. But there is a real thread. The Taiping failed to build the state it intended. It succeeded, over the following decades, in demonstrating at enormous cost that the Qing dynasty could be challenged, that the existing order was not inevitable, that the gap between what the Chinese population was experiencing and what their governance was delivering was wide enough to sustain a mass movement willing to fight. The lesson the next generation drew from the Taiping was not theological. It was political, but it was drawn from the Taiping's example, and from the specific way the Taiping had failed, and from the question of what a different kind of movement might do differently. The specifically Christian element of the Taiping movement did not persist in any direct institutional form. The Heavenly Kingdom's theology, Xiuquan's particular synthesis of Protestant missionary materials, Confucian learning, and personal vision died with the state that had embodied it. There was no successor church, no surviving congregation that carried the Taiping theological tradition forward into the 20th century in recognizable form. But Christianity in China did not die. Protestant and Catholic missionary activity continued throughout the late Qing period and into the 20th century, growing significantly in the decades after 1864. The relationship between the Taiping and the subsequent growth of Chinese Christianity is contested among scholars. Some have argued that the association of Christianity with the Taiping catastrophe complicated missionary work in certain regions. Others have argued that the Taiping demonstrated, however catastrophically, Christianity's capacity to speak to Chinese social conditions in ways that later movements built on. What is clear is that the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom was not, as some Western observers hoped at the time and some have argued since, simply a Chinese appropriation of Western Christianity that went wrong. It was something more specifically Chinese, a synthesis that reflected the particular conditions of 1840s Guangdong, the particular experience of a Hakka man who had failed the examinations 4 times, the particular theological creativity of someone who had absorbed a framework and then rebuilt it from the inside according to visions that no pamphlet had given him and no missionary could fully explain. The missionaries who encountered Taiping theology and found it troubling were right that it was not their Christianity. What they sometimes failed to see was that this was not a corruption of an original, it was a new thing, built from available materials in response to specific conditions by a man who was, by any measure, doing something more than misreading a text. The question of Xiuquan himself of what he believed, and whether he believed it, is one that the historical sources approach but cannot fully answer. Contemporary sources describe, at various points in his life, a man of genuine conviction. The missionaries who met him in Nanjing, however troubled by his theology, did not generally describe a cynical fraud. They described a man who inhabited his framework with a completeness that was, to them, both impressive and alarming. Li Shusheng, in his confession written under duress, which means it requires careful reading, describes a man who genuinely believed that God would send manna to a starving city. The theological texts Hong composed in Nanjing, the volume of them, the internal consistency, The evident labor that went into maintaining a coherent theological system across years of isolation and siege. These are not the products of a performance. They are the products of someone who had organized his entire inner life around a framework and could not stop. At the same time, the man who lived in a palace compound surrounded by concubines while his city starved, who refused to allow evacuation because the prophecy did not permit it, who appointed his brothers to positions of power because they were his brothers. This man's conviction was costing other people their lives in ways that he appears in the sources not to have experienced as costs at all. This is not a unique feature of prophetic leadership. It appears across the history of movements and traditions, in figures who are separated by everything except this specific dynamic. The founder's certainty that insulates him from doubt also insulates him from the feedback that ordinary political accountability would provide. When you believe you are the younger son of God, the deaths of others in service of that belief are not failures of your judgment. They are the price of the vision. They are what God requires. They are, perhaps, the purification that precedes the manna. The framework that gave Xiuquan the conviction to step into a gap in 1843, to walk out of his family's house with nothing but a pamphlet and a memory of a vision and begin preaching to communities that had every reason to listen. That same framework made it impossible for him to acknowledge, in 1864, that the city was lost and the people inside it needed to leave. The strength and the catastrophe were the same thing. They came from the same place. Nanjing today is a city of 8 million people. The Ming Dynasty walls, some of the largest ancient city walls still standing anywhere in the world, are a tourist attraction. Lit at night. Photographed by visitors who may or may not know what happened inside them in 1864. A museum dedicated to the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, established in the People's Republic period, presents the movement within a specific interpretive frame: peasant rebellion, anti-feudal struggle, historical precursor of revolutionary movements that manages the theology carefully and the death toll even more carefully. The museum exists because the People's Republic needed the Taiping to mean something that could be incorporated into a narrative of Chinese history moving toward liberation. The theology was inconvenient for this purpose. The death toll was more than inconvenient. So the museum navigates. This is not a criticism unique to one government's historical framing. The interpretive frame a society places around a catastrophic prophetic movement tells you something about what that society needs the catastrophe to mean. The Qing court needed it to mean the restoration of order. The Republican generation needed it to mean the first attempt at revolution. The People's Republic needed it to mean class struggle. Western historians needed it to mean, for a long time, a cautionary tale about the dangers of religious enthusiasm in non-Western settings. What it actually was is harder to hold than any of these framings. A movement of genuine social protest, organized around a theology that proved incapable of acknowledging its own failures, that killed tens of millions of people and left the dynasty too weakened to survive another 50 years, and that is, somehow, also the story of a specific man, in a specific village, in a specific province, who believed himself brilliant, who was told 4 times that he was not, and who found in a 9-page pamphlet a framework that transformed every failure into preparation. Those things are all the same story. None of the framings is wrong. None of them is sufficient. This season has looked at 4 prophetic frameworks now. Manifest destiny, a phrase coined by a journalist, deployed by a dominant power to justify continental expansion against peoples with less power. The 1,000-Year Reich, a claim built by a state with the full apparatus of industrial modernity. Searchlights, cameras, the compulsory organization of 90% of eligible German youth. The Mahdi of Sudan, a claim built with almost none of that. by a colonized man against an occupying power, with 300 followers and a prophecy 12 centuries old. And now this, a man alone with a pamphlet, a vision he could not explain for 6 years, a framework assembled from missionary Christianity, Confucian learning, and the specific experience of being a brilliant man in a system that had declined 4 times, to recognize him before drawing anything from the comparison. The same caveat that has appeared in every episode of this season applies here with particular force. These 4 cases differ in ways that matter morally and historically. The Taiping movement was a colonial-era peasant uprising against a dynasty that was itself partially a vehicle for Western imperial interests in China. Manifest destiny was the ideology of westward conquest. The Nazi state was a genocidal regime. Structural similarity does not mean moral equivalence. And treating these cases as equivalent because they share a pattern would be a distortion of all of them. The pattern is analytically useful. The moral distinctions are not dissolved by identifying the pattern. What the Taiping case adds to the season's argument is not another instance of the same story. It is a variation on the story that none of the other cases provides, and the variation is specific. The Mahdi state was destroyed from outside by a technology that the prophecy could not reframe. The Maxim gun fired 600 rounds per minute and had no relationship to divine appointment. The machine gun simply fired. The prophecy outlasted the state, as this season has noted, and it is present in Sudanese political life today. The Taiping Heavenly Kingdom was also eventually destroyed from outside by the Xiang army, by the ever-victorious army, by the strategic decisions of foreign powers that had calculated their interest and sided with the Qing, but the process that made it destroyable, that hollowed out its leadership, fractured its military command, trapped its population inside a besieged city. When a military withdrawal might have prolonged the state's survival, that process was internal. The Nanjing incident of 1856 was not a Qing attack. It was the Heavenly Kingdom killing its most capable administrator because the prophetic framework had no mechanism for managing a power struggle except elimination. Yang Xiuqing had used the framework's own logic, divine possession, the authority of the father to accumulate power that threatened Hong's position, and the framework provided no way to contest that authority through argument, through politics, through the ordinary mechanisms by which human institutions manage competing claims. The only available response, inside a system organized around absolute divine authority, was to kill the man who had found a way to outrank you within it. Wei Zhenghu, Qin Rigang, Shi Dakai's departure, Hong Rengan's reforms that arrived too late and were never adequately implemented. These Xu Cheng's advice to evacuate, refused because the prophecy did not permit it. Each of these is a moment where the internal logic of the prophetic framework produced an outcome that made the movement weaker, more brittle, less capable of surviving external pressure. The framework was not only the engine of the movement's rise, it was the engine of its internal collapse. And this is the thing that the Mahdi's case ended abruptly from outside does not show as clearly. A prophecy that cannot be falsified also cannot be reformed, and a framework that cannot be reformed, when it encounters the friction of governing a real state with real people and real competing interests, tends to resolve that friction through the elimination of the people who are generating it. The movement ends up fighting itself before it finishes fighting its enemies. There is something else the Taiping case introduces that this season has been moving toward, and it requires sitting with Xiuquan as a person rather than as a historical force. In the cases examined so far, the founders and leaders of prophetic movements have been treated primarily as political and social phenomena, as functions of the gap they filled, the frameworks they deployed, the movements they built. That is the correct analytical approach at the scale of history. But Xiuquan is also a specific human being, And the specific human being is not incidental to the story. He was a man who was, by all accounts, exceptionally intelligent from childhood. His village believed in him. His family organized their resources around his potential. He spent his adult life in preparation for a system that had promised implicitly, structurally, by the very fact of its existence, that demonstrated ability would be recognized. He demonstrated his ability 4 times across 15 years. The system looked at him and said, "Not you. There is a kind of wound that this produces that is different from ordinary failure. Ordinary failure can be attributed to bad luck, to insufficient preparation, to circumstances outside your control. The wound that 4 rejections by a system that was supposed to be meritocratic produces is more specifically targeted. It does not say you were unlucky. It says the judgment of the institution, which is the judgment of the civilization, which is the judgment of the cosmos as that civilization understands it, is that you are not what you believe you are." Xiuquan had organized his entire sense of himself around being what he believed he was. The examination system told him 4 times that the self he had built was wrong, and then a pamphlet offered an alternative explanation. The examination system had not failed to recognize him. The examination system was one of the corruptions he had been sent to overthrow. He was not a failed examination candidate. He was the younger son of God, for whom the examinations were irrelevant, a test the cosmos had designed to prepare him, not to judge him. His 15 years of study and failure and humiliation were not a biography of a man the world had declined to notice. They were the formation of a prophet. The framework resolved the wound completely. It did not require Hong to revise his estimate of himself downward. It required him to revise his understanding of the system upward, to see it not as an authority that had evaluated him accurately, but as a corruption that had failed to recognize what it was looking at. Most people who fail examinations do not found apocalyptic states. The conditions that turned Hong's personal experience into the foundation of a mass movement was specific and contingent at the particular social tensions of 1840s Guangdong, the particular pamphlet at the particular examination hall, the particular 6-year gap between vision and interpretation that meant the framework arrived at exactly the moment of maximum need. Change any of those conditions and the movement does not happen. The personal wound alone does not produce a Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. But the personal dimension was real, and it was doing work inside the movement that the social explanation alone cannot fully account for. This matters because it points towards something that recurs across the cases this season has examined, in different forms and at different scales. The gap that prophetic frameworks fill is not only social. It is not only the gap between what a civilization promises and what daily life delivers. It is also, often, the gap between who specific people believe they are and what the existing order has told them they are. O'Sullivan's manifest destiny spoke to a nation that believed its continental expansion was not only justified but fated, a nation that needed the conquest of the continent to be something other than conquest, to be the fulfillment of a destiny written into the nature of things. The framework resolved, at the level of national self-understanding, the discomfort of building an empire while believing you are not an imperial power. The 1,000-year Reich spoke to a country that had been told, by the outcome of the First World War and the terms of the Versailles Treaty, that it was a defeated power, a diminished nation, a civilization that had been weighed and found wanting. The prophetic framework of national destiny and racial superiority resolved that verdict by reframing it. The defeat was not a judgment. It was a betrayal, and the betrayers had names and addresses. The Mahdi spoke to communities that had been told by the Turco-Egyptian administration and the British Empire behind it that they were colonial subjects whose governance was not their own concern. The prophetic framework resolved that verdict by reframing it. The foreign administration was not legitimate authority. It was the oppression that the prophecy had foretold, and its end was not a political possibility but a divine certainty. And Xiuquan was a man who had been told, 4 times, by the most authoritative institution his civilization possessed, that he was not what he believed he was. The prophetic framework resolved that verdict by reframing it. The examination system was not an authority. It was a corruption, and the man it had declined to recognize was the younger son of God. The structure is the same. The content is different. The moral weight is different. The scale of consequence is radically different. But the movement from wound to framework to mission, the specific way a prophetic claim can take the experience of being told you are not enough and transform it into evidence that you are more than anyone knew. This movement appears across cases that have nothing else in common. It is worth understanding, not because it explains everything, but because it explains something that the social analysis alone cannot reach. The Taiping Heavenly Kingdom lasted 14 years. It controlled territory larger than France. It killed somewhere between 20 and 30 million people. It left behind a dynasty too weakened to survive another half-century. A generation of revolutionaries who drew lessons from its failure, and a landscape that took 50 years to recover. It started with a man who picked up a pamphlet. The pamphlet was being distributed at an examination hall at a place where hundreds of thousands of men were gathered. Many of them educated enough to be dangerous. Many of them in a system that had promised to recognize merit and was, in practice, recognizing a tiny fraction of the people who had organized their lives around that promise. The pamphlet found the right person at the right moment. It found a man with a vision he could not explain, a failure he could not accept, and a mind trained by 15 years of examination preparation to organize experience into coherent frameworks and make them hold. He read it. He waited 6 years, and then he understood. The empire he built on that understanding lasted 14 years and killed 20 million people. The pamphlet was 9 pages long,